Okay, I want to welcome everybody. My name is Peter Lichtenberg. My background is as a geriatric neuropsychologist, and so I've been doing evaluations for Alzheimer's disease and other related dementias my entire career, from outpatients to residents in long-term care, a lot of behavioral treatment in that setting, as well as a number of psychological treatments for outpatients. So I'm delighted to be with you. And we do have a chat box. I want to tell all the people that just joined us, please put your email in the chat box. We're going to be sending you a copy of these slides and also a reminder to the link for the evaluation that we need. Well, I want you to come on a little bit of a journey with me and to examine sort of our work in financial decision making and how it relates to cognition and aging, early cognitive impairment, and financial exploitation. We're going to talk about some of our own research on fraud and scams and our methods for creating some new financial decision rating scales. Very little on the validation side, but just to let you know what we've been doing. And then our training and implementation and how anybody can have access to that without charge. So a little primer on cognitive aging. Gerontologists will tell you that really there's two types of cognitive abilities: crystallized and fluid intelligence. And crystallized intelligence is really about facts and expertise. And so vocabulary is a great example of that. And that doesn't stop when you turn 20 or 25. That really continues to grow throughout much of the lifespan. And so it's not true that aging is only associated with declines. It's actually also associated with gains. And that is what a lot of companies find out about older workers, the knowledge and expertise that they have and how important that is. Fluid intelligence, on the other hand, are things that are effortful. New memories, in other words, new information being remembered, reaction time, we all slow down, and problem solving and planning, what we call executive functioning. And those effortful processes tend to decline with age. Now, these are looking at cross-sectional and longitudinal data. In the gray is cross-sectional, and the red burgundy is longitudinal, and they're pretty much the same. But that's because they've been corrected. If you hadn't corrected for education, for example, if you just compared 20, 40, 60, and 80-year-olds, it'd be a straight line down, and you would think that cognition peaks at 20. But what we found is that every cohort is better educated than the one before it, and that accounted for a lot of the differences. So that got made up for. Now, what do you have to adjust for in longitudinal data is practice effects. So you get better scores because you've seen the tests before. And once you do these corrections, you can see a very similar kind of line. And that's pretty stable cognition until you start to see people in their 70s, and then particularly into their 80s, you start to see a reliable decline. And you know, one of the things about that is this is for group data, and individual differences always have to be considered with aging. No greater variability than older adults. Some at 95, 105 are doing great. Others at 65 are really struggling. And here you see kind of three types of groups: maintainers, minor decliners, and major decliners. And the maintainers are ones who, yeah, you know, they're really doing just as well as people in their 50s during this decade, 70s, 79, even into the 80s. And that's about 15% or so of the population. And so all of us are going to aspire to be in this. I can tell just from the signups that probably everybody on the line will be in this maintainer group, and that's good news. The minor decliners, this is sort of the, oh, thank you. If everybody would mute, we're getting some noise feedback, and one of the participants reminded me to have everybody mute themselves, and I thank you for that. Minor decline is sort of what we showed before. This is the decrement that gets small but reliable towards the end of the 70s. And that is about 2/3 or so of the population. And then you have these major decliners. Even though this is normal aging and cognition, not people with dementia, for some reason, their cognitive scores go down a little bit more precipitously. So we have all kinds of patterns in cognitive aging. Now, switching to Alzheimer's disease, then, which is a much more pronounced form of cognitive impairment, although not easily detected at first. There's the great man himself, Alois Alzheimer, and his patient was August D. She was in her 40s. Her memory impairment was very constant, and she was very delusional. So she had both the psychiatric and cognitive symptoms. The third area is function, and of course it interfered with her ability to be independent. Alzheimer's was really an expert in neurosyphilis, but he worked with a couple of people, Nissl and Kraepelin, who really had a lot to do with his discovery. Nissl developed this brain staining technique that allowed Alzheimer's, when August D died, she actually progressed very rapidly. When she died, they were able to do brain autopsy, and with Nissl's stains, they discovered these neuritic plaques and neurofibrillary tangles that are the neuropathological hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. And it wasn't named Alzheimer's disease until his boss, Kraepelin, did so in 1909, when he wanted to make the institute that they worked at a little bit more popular. Why are we all so concerned about this? Well, on your left, you see a chart of CIND, cognitive impairment, no dementia. This is minor cognitive impairment, but it's greater than would be expected for normal aging. And then on the right, you have AD, or Alzheimer's disease. Even in age 70, this is a population-based survey, and a lot of the estimates that the Alzheimer's Association uses came out of this group, actually. 19.5% of people in their 70s have some kind of minor or major neurocognitive impairment. That's a lot of people for that young an age. Of course, it's only 3.5% have Alzheimer's disease. But in the 80s, you can see it goes up to about 39% combined, and a little bit over 60% for people in their 90s. Notice, however, even in the 90s, still relatively low, 22% with Alzheimer's disease. So kind of interesting set of statistics. One thing about staging dementia to remember, I think I mentioned this already once, it's not just about cognition, it's a lot about function. So the definition of dementia is a decline in cognition that interferes with function. And the kinds of interference that you can look at if you're thinking, boy, I want to take a closer look and see if this person is showing cognitive impairment that has impacted their function. Look at home and hobbies. What are they doing around the house that they used to do, or what have they stopped doing, or the hobbies that they have, or community affairs such as volunteerism. Those are some of the early ways you can really get a handle on how somebody's withdrawn from some of the social roles and the personal enjoyment roles that they had that are kind of dictated maybe by their cognitive impairment. Of course, memory, orientation, judgment are other domains, and then self-care. Well, here's the classic awful case of somebody with Alzheimer's disease being financially exploited. George and his wife both had dementia, but hers was fairly mild, I guess. His was moderate to severe. She's the caregiver, and she's the one who died. Now, in the doctor's notes, when I reviewed this case, when it went to probate, they said, well, you can't tell George anything. He can't remember at all. So you have to just talk to his wife, even though her memory's pretty bad too. So you can see that they were living sort of on the edge. And then son Leo took it upon himself to move in with George and become his power of attorney, moved out of his trailer into George's house. And he said, well, let's take some of George's money, about $425,000. And really, I did get the chance to look at what he spent it on. And this was my conclusion. Can you really eat that much Taco Bell or other similar things? Amazing how quickly that money was wasted on nothing. But this is the next one. Leo has an attorney and a financial planner that come to the house for George to sign quitclaim deeds. It's a reminder that we have bad actors in every profession. And, it's so unfortunate, but these two, the attorney and financial planner, said that, yeah, you know, they came to see George and that those quitclaim deeds were valid. Well, actually, George was not really able to see them the day they came, it turns out, even though they gave affidavits that he had signed these things. If you looked at the forms, Leo signed them, and he signed them in his own name. And so the attorney and the planner had to admit they never saw George the day he signed. So it was pretty easy for the judge to order all the property to go to Leo's brother. And this was the only case I've ever been involved in where the judge actually got it right to the prosecutor. And Leo did end up going to jail. But that's a classic awful case of this. So let's look at the syndrome of dementia. Interferes with the ability to function due to cognitive and neuropsychiatric symptoms. It has to be a decline from previous functioning. It can't be due to a delirium, that is acute confusional state that can clear up once the medical condition underlying it is treated. And the impairment is detected through history and at least some objective assessment, and it crosses at least 2 domains. Now, when you get to diagnosing Alzheimer's disease, it's still a clinical diagnosis. So this is the criteria for probable Alzheimer's disease. The only definitive diagnosis remains with brain tissue. And of course, that is only gotten, except for very rare cases actually of temporal lobe epilepsy surgery, brain tissue is only gotten upon brain autopsy. Meets the criteria for dementia as a very insidious onset. When you ask families to look back once they finally get to an evaluation for dementia, say, when did you first notice, you know, the first cognitive sign, you know, misplaced keys in a strange place, or, you know, mom got lost coming to Thanksgiving dinner and said, oh, I just wasn't paying attention. And usually families will be looking back 2 to 3 years. So it's that invisible period where people are wondering if something's wrong, but seems like normal cognition, just aging, that people are very vulnerable to financial mismanagement and exploitation. For it to be Alzheimer's disease, there has to be a clear-cut history of worsening progression because it is a progressive disorder. I think it's about the 5th or 6th leading cause of death now on death certificates. The most common form, of course, is that with memory disorders or amnestic, but there can be others, executive functioning, language, so forth, can be the first symptoms. So we're often in these cases where we have an older adult and there may or may not be some cognitive impairment, wondering about capacity. And financial exploitation seems to be the dark side of a lot of financial capacity assessments. And the kind I'm going to talk about today includes some interaction between the older adult victim and another trusted person. Ken Conrad and his colleagues came up with 6 domains for financial exploitation. The most serious, and of course the final step in an exploitation, is actually getting the money. So theft or scams. So I either steal it from you or fraudulently get you to give it to me. The next 3 are really more about the mechanisms for how exploitation occurs. Abuse of trust. So this can be family, this can be professionals, this could be a new caregiver that came into the home, someone that gained your trust. Could be a workman who gains your trust and abuses it. Financial entitlement is a very important concept to be thinking about, because a lot of older adults who do exploit their parents or exploit their grandparents, adult children or grandchildren who do that, feel entitled. They really do believe that this is my money, it's coming to me anyway, I'm going to inherit it, and I'm just using it a little bit early. You and I know that's actually theft, but this is the mindset that people have. And it usually comes about because now they start talking to or taking their parent or grandparent to the doctor or running some errands for them. And so they really get a sense of, okay, I'm put out by this. So we need a car to get grandma around. Let's get a new one. And oh, I'll drive it 99% of the time and she can pay for it all. Coercion or undue influence is often indirect evidence of somebody pressuring, cajoling, all kinds of things, threatening at times, to take away somebody's free will. And that's really what coercion does in the end, so that somebody else's will is substituted and the exploitation occurs. Then the last 2 domains are really risk factors, signs of exploitation, possible exploitation, and then money management difficulties. And money management difficulties are definitely a risk factor for exploitation. One of the shortcomings of the scale, the older adult financial exploitation measure that has those domains, is it doesn't assess financial decision making. So we don't know whether somebody has made an authentic decision to part with some of their money, whether it's a gift or an investment or a purchase. Well, how much exploitation is there? This study by Ron Asciano and colleagues is quoted probably the most often. It's a population-based national probability sample, and says across the previous 12 months, 5.2% of older adults report being the victims of exploitation, financial exploitation. It's the most common form of elder abuse. Excuse me, second most common, psychological abuse being the most common. In their study, 60% was misappropriated by family, 40% by strangers. Vulnerability is always present, or almost always present, and in their study, it was activities of daily living deficits and the non-use of social services. So you get a sense of isolation for somebody who has disability and needs some help, either bathing, grooming, dressing, transferring, toileting. So they needed some help with one of those activities of daily living, and they weren't getting that help by anybody except the person that was exploiting them. Other research has showed similar kinds of prevalence studies and a little bit different risk factors. When you do these survey research, you're not including people who with significant cognitive problems. So you're actually find out that the younger old, those of 55 to 65, may be even a little bit more likely to be exploited than the older old. So it depends how you sample. But in both these studies, Lawman and Beach, African Americans were more likely to report exploitation. And Beach studied some risk factors, depression, ADL deficits, again, showed up. Now, our study was one of the first national studies of fraud. We were able to use a national probability sample from the Health and Retirement Survey sub-study to do a couple of studies predicting fraud. One had both longitudinal and cross-sectional data to it. The other was purely longitudinal. And the 2013 findings, what we found was those with the highest levels of depression and lowest social needs fulfillment, that is, they felt like their status in society was very low. Invisibility plus depression, they had a 3 times greater likelihood. So 1 in 7 had been defrauded across the past 4 years, as opposed to 1 in 25 for the rest of the sample. In our follow-up study, where we just used longitudinal data, it was reduced a little bit to a little bit over 2 times as likely, 1 in 9, roughly, or excuse me, 1 in 11, again, compared to 1 in 25. So it convinced me and our team that when you think about decision making, you really have to think about psychological vulnerability as well. So this has been the area that I've been spending my time with our group, trying to both research and produce new tools. This intersection of exploitation, capacity, and Alzheimer's disease. All of the work on capacity really originates with informed decision making. And this groundbreaking work by Paul Applebaum and Tom Grisso, published in 1988, reflected the change in guardianship laws. The change from, if you have a diagnosis, you can get a guardian, to what? To a functional test, and that functional test is informed decision making. So then they ask, what does that consist of? Well, here it is. 4 aspects of decision making. Can the person communicate choice, what they want to do, an understanding of that choice, how it impacts them, what are the likely outcomes, what are the likely outcomes of other choices, appreciation, how much risk are they putting out there, how much benefit do they see, who might it impact besides themselves, and reasoning, or in our situation, rationale. Why are they doing this? Is it something that is reasonable, or is it based on some kind of delusional thinking? So we went about trying to create a person-centered rating scale. What is person-centeredness? You know, really, and Ben Mast has written wonderfully about this, both in his book and also in this article about whole person care. And that is, it's so important, no matter what the vulnerabilities of an older adult, to maintain their dignity, their honor, and their respect in the way that we all treat them. So many older adults will say that if they go to a provider of any kind with somebody else, the provider will only talk to the younger person and start ignoring that, especially if they have any kind of a diagnosis. So it's really important not to do that. It's very important to understand the older adult, who they were, who they are. It matters what needs they feel they have, their relationship, what their values and beliefs are. And this really can help us understand their behaviors and also their planning. You know, experience matters, as I said before, in crystallized intelligence. So people who have a lot of experience, say in finances throughout their life, may well be able to make some certain financial decisions, even in early dementia. We also kind of recognize that hypothetical vignettes about judgment may overemphasize deficits, so we want to analyze the actual decision. But as we all know, people are much more than the sum of their cognitive abilities. The context matters, and psychological vulnerability is key also. But the key question in elder justice, which we're all involved in, is both over and under protection can lead to damaging consequences. So it's always a balancing act. Under protection for older adults can lead to gross financial exploitation, but overprotection can be equally as costly. And I don't think many people realize this, that most older adults still have that very strong need for autonomy and control. And if we restrict that too early, it's not only going to lead to a decline in their quality of life, but it very well may shorten their life, and has been shown to do so in some studies. We used the concept mapping model that Ken Conrad used for his financial exploitation measure. As a matter of fact, we hired Ken and his colleague Mickey Iris to help us. We had 2 expert panels that helped us create our conceptual model and the new scale. So here's our model for our rating scale, which is about financial decision making. And you can see under the intellectual factors, those aspects of Applebaum and Grisso: choice, what we're calling rationale, understanding, and appreciation. And on the left-hand box, the contextual factors: financial awareness, psychological vulnerability, and those last 2 are really about susceptibility. And I'll share some data later about those questions. But let's kind of illustrate our scale with this case. This is an 82-year-old retired divorcee. He was worth about $12 million, but at the time that I got to know him, it was mostly in properties. He, as you'll see, he used up most of his cash. He got tangled up in 2 romance scams, but they also had a inheritance twist to them, because they could really appeal to his desire to have more money. So this was more of a status thing for him, I think, than it was really kind of an investment thing. I think he just wanted to build his estate, but he wanted it very badly. And the twist was that these women who wanted to marry him could only receive their inheritance if they were married, because their culture wouldn't permit it. So each of them was worth 15 million. But of course, they have attorney and other fees that have to be paid before we can go get the 15 million. Now, of course, he never met these people. They don't really exist. He talked to women that pretended to be these 2 individuals. Well, in the course of about 6 months or so, maybe a little bit less, he spent about $800,000 cash, sent it all through wiring. He finally got desperate to meet his wife and drove 1,000 miles to look for her. Of course, she didn't live where he drove to. He ran into literally a state trooper who got him to the hospital, and his kids came and got him, took him to another state. And I was asked to come out and do an evaluation on him. So let's take a look at the impact of this exploitation. One thing is that once they started getting the money, they kept calling for more, and they would call him constantly around the clock. So he stopped really sleeping very much, stopped eating. There was rotted food in the fridge the kids found. And here's a really big impact. He had failed to pay his taxes, so he was about to be foreclosed on. So pretty clear that this was having a tremendous impact on him. But he was very smart and very high functioning cognitively, with only 2 deficits, one in executive functioning and the other being his paranoia. And it was about his kids, who had gone to great trouble. The bank president and an FBI agent separately spent hours with this individual trying to convince him he was being scammed. But his assertion to me was, hey, I'm worth several million. Let me spend the money the way I want. So he doesn't have dementia. He does have some executive functioning deficits. So capacity is kind of in a question. So let's take a look at his informed financial decision making about sending this money to, quote, his wives. One of the questions we asked him, what's your primary financial goal for this decision? He said, lifestyle. But that's not true. He also wanted the money because he talked about it a lot. He wanted to his ship to come in so he could show everybody that his marriage was not only going to be nice for him in a relationship, but it was going to be financially nice. How will this decision impact you financially now and over time? He said, it will improve my financial position. I didn't agree with that response either in the terms of, was it accurate? So what the rater does is respond whether you think that their response given is accurate or not. And then you select what you think the most accurate response is. Of course, it's the negative impact. He had a history of losing a ton of money and almost losing his home. He says there's no risk, and of course there's a lot of high risk here. So you can see with these questions of understanding and appreciation, he's not making an informed decision. Last things, how often your monthly expenses exceed your regular monthly income. He admitted some of the time that during the last months of his scam that he was basically out of cash. But he was also very paranoid, and his relationship with some of his family members had become strained because they wanted to take away his financial freedom and use his money without his permission. Of course, they just wanted to protect him. And there was nobody that needed or was digging at his money. So you can see sort of the other part of the susceptibility for him, and I'm sure this was felt by the scammers, is that his paranoia. I want to introduce to all of you the 10-item tracker. So this is foundational, the rating scale, and you'll recognize some of the items there. And let's go through a little bit of the work that we've done on the scale. And you can see that we partnered with the eminent Ron Tatro and Cynthia Farrell on our first publication. Cynthia, of course, is statewide for APS, and Ron, of course, Elder Law of Michigan. Does the scale measure the intersection of informed decision-making abilities and financial exploitation? Well, how are we going to answer that? Several professionals in the financial services industry and in the legal industry were administering the scale, worried about informed decision-making or basically basic capacity. And APS workers were administering the scale, worried about financial substantiation of exploitation. In both cases, the risk score for either not understanding or appreciating or not understanding even the choice that somebody had made, excuse me, was the risk score was higher both for the professionals and the APS cases. We went on then to really do a stronger validation and clinical prediction of this. And I want to sort of take you through how I utilize this case, do some pro bono work for prosecutors around the state. And this is a case of a 73-year-old man in the farm country who had a small business that he had sold because of his early dementia. Now, he lived surrounded by family within within a mile or two. He had 3 or 4 different family members, siblings, nieces, nephews. And throughout his life, he had loaned money to his brothers and his nieces, but never more than $3,500. And he kept a very careful account. He had a ledger, and he had the amount that he'd loaned and the amount that was paid back and when it was paid back. So we look for these differences, as you'll see as we go on, and ask the question of why. So the brother lived down the road interacted with him daily. And one day, our 73-year-old gentleman received a winning sweepstakes ticket in the mail. He called his wife and said he had to drive to the nearest town to go claim it. And of course, she was very concerned. She was not at home. She was out shopping, didn't want him to go, but he was determined. So she alerted the brother, who was able to deter the gentleman from going. This became important because in unjust enrichment, you either have to know somebody has a cognitive impairment or susceptibility, or should know. Well, he obviously did know, or should have known, because of this incident, if not everything else that had been shared. Well, I guess the sweepstakes scam must have given him some ideas, because he, a couple weeks later himself, without talking to the gentleman's wife, goes to the bank with his brother. Okay, so takes the man with some early dementia to cash in his IRA for over $100,000 so the brother can, quote, pay off his mortgage. Of course, the gentleman's wife finds out about this when the bank statement comes in and calls the brother, asks for the money back. Oh no, your husband wanted to give it to me. And even the brother, or excuse me, the man says, of course I want to give it to him. We can afford it, no problem. They really couldn't. And so she called the prosecutor, who charged the brother with unjust enrichment. Now, he asked me to come do an evaluation. So it's only a few months after the incident, so I was able to use a scale and also the informant scale and learn some things. You'll see that, again, he didn't understand or appreciate what he was doing. He didn't really understand the impact of it. And when you look at the history, he really was concerned about money all the time. And then his wife had taken care of all their money for the last year and a half because of his dementia. And with this undue influence idea, you look at deception that the brother used, susceptibility, and the tactics that he used, really playing on the gentleman's need to be somebody who can do something special for somebody now that he has early dementia. So let's look at some of the questions and also the family and friends interview, which is the informant scale. How will this decision to give $100,000 impact you over time or now? No impact. But that's not correct, because he's got early dementia. He's 73. He's got a long way to go. They're probably going to need some long-term care at some time, and he doesn't have millions. He's doing well, but they are not hugely wealthy family. How much risk to your financial well-being? He says none, and I thought it was moderate. Well, let's look at his wife's response. How will this decision impact you, your relative, your husband, or financially over time? And she said, well, it's going to have a major negative impact, and this is moderate risk. And this question, does your relative or friend worry about financial decisions they recently made? And she said, you know, he worries about money all the time. He doesn't remember this decision in particular unless somebody asks him about it, and then he says, oh yeah, of course I wanted to do it. But if you said, when was the last time you went to that bank, he wouldn't be able to tell you. But he's very worried about money. So it's clear that somebody is taking advantage of him, and that this would be very unusual. So it's clear that this is a difference. He wasn't this kind of overly generous person throughout his life. Okay. So here are some of the items in the larger scale and the subscale that I just want to share with you. And here's some of what we learned in our first study of a different sample, community sample of 200 individuals from the wealthiest and poorest neighborhoods here in Southeast Michigan. Everybody's worried about money. Almost 60% are somewhat or very worried about having enough money to pay for things. And a lot of that is almost half of the group are financially helping someone on a regular basis. And a lot of this stems from the 2008 recession, when adult children really turned to their parents, and then in many cases now, grandchildren turning to their grandparents for some financial help. We're looking at financial awareness, and we see that over a quarter of people are worried about financial decisions they recently made. And this one question is a very good interview question that'll give you a way of getting people to talk about some of these financial decisions, many of which may have been exploitative. So that's why they're worried about them. They've been exploited and they know it somehow. Almost a third were not confident or unsure about making decisions. So there's a lot of worry and a lot of uncertainty. And remember that a lot of older adults are women who are widowed, especially as we get into the 80s and beyond. And many of them did not handle finances all their life, so they're at a disadvantage. Here's some of the questions for the psychological vulnerability, and some of the answers that we got were very interesting too. 41% wish they had someone to talk to about finances. So these are the people who are going to probably end up talking to the wrong person, or a good subgroup of them. But it shows you how much anxiety about money and loneliness there is. It really has become a taboo topic, finances. And that silence really plays into the whole susceptibility to exploitation. People are anxious about their own finances. Over a third have lost a confidant in the last 2 years. And over 40% felt downhearted and blue about their finances. This next question, I thought maybe nobody would answer this, but it's very similar to what we found in our fraud study. That is that over a third felt like they're treated with less respect and courtesy around financial decisions and transactions. And this is this loss of status or ageism or invisibility question that I think of. And so that's a big number there. And then about 15% rated themselves as having poorer memory thinking skills around finances than a year ago. So you can see a lot of different psychological vulnerabilities. And then the susceptibility items are really about relationship strain and conflict. So almost a third answered yes to this question. Has your relationship, as you've grown older, has your relationship with someone close to you changed due to finances? And as I said, almost a third said yes. Almost 1 in 5 talked to a purchase they didn't originally want to do. 16% had conflicts about money, and this excluded spouses. So these conflicts about money were really with adult children or other close people. 20% reported they had had money taken, half of which were large amounts, over $1,000. But very few were worried that somebody wanted to take control of their finances. So during this study, we collected a lot of cognitive data. And none of these individuals that we tested had dementia at this time. But some had what we call cognitive decline, possible cognitive decline. We gave 10 cognitive tests, and if they had 4 scores, that were between 1 and 1.5 standard deviations below the mean, then we would call that possible cognitive decline. So that was 38 individuals. So 19% of our group had possible cognitive decline. What's interesting is those with financial exploitation or not. And you can see that just the cognitive decline, that far right here, that if you had cognitive status within normal limits, you had about 14% reported being financially exploited within the last 2 years. If you had possible cognitive decline, that was double, so over 30%. The biggest risk factor, and we know this, for exploitation in older adults is cognitive impairment, cognitive decline. But there's more nuance to it. And even though these numbers get a little bit small, we're continuing to study them, and we're finding in our new data very similar kinds of results. This gets a little more tricky. Now we're looking at FDA, which is financial decisional abilities. So using our scale and coming in at no concerns or some or major concerns. So 2 categories for the within normal limit group and for the possible cognitive decline group. And no self-suspected financial exploitation, and yes, financial exploitation. So if you scored within normal limits, you had no concerns, 14% was the base rate. So just like we saw last time. And very few people who scored within normal limits, 5 in fact, had some concerns about their decision-making abilities. But if you had possible cognitive decline and no concerns about your decision-making, it was about 15%, very similar to the base rate for people who even were within normal limits cognitively. If you did have decision-making concerns plus possible cognitive decline, excuse me, 8 out of 11 or had financial exploitation. So the number goes up dramatically. So it's this intersection that we talk about. We did want to create also a informant scale, and here's the items for that scale. And so this is self-report by a trusted other, somebody that you would like to get information from. And it has really 2 subscales. One is about decision-making of the older adult. What decision did they make? Was it their idea? How much will it impact them financially? How much risk is there? And the second one is more of the psychosocial financial awareness questions. How satisfied are they with finances? Who manages their money? Are they helping anyone on a regular basis? Anxiety, depression, and so forth. So here's some of the data that we found. This is a totally new sample. So this is an additional 150 people. So you get the idea that our group has been talking to lots of folks, both through others and ourselves, our own recruitment. So this study of 150 was a totally brand new sample of informants, some of whom were caregivers, although most of whom were not. And we wanted them not to be, but they had a close relationship with an older adult. And 32 of the 150 were concerned that the older adult was being financially exploited, either was already or would be soon. And you can see some of the ages and so forth. Education of the older adults was over 13 years. Our genders were mostly women that were the informants, and approximately half African American. What do we find? Whoops. I left out those. Oh, I'm sorry. Here we go. what we found is that there are no differences between the two groups, financial exploitation, non-financial exploitation, in terms of any of the demographics. And somehow I left out the key table, which showed that all the differences were in decision-making abilities. So the scale seemed to work quite well in distinguishing between concerns for exploitation and not. So what have we been doing? We wanted to take all of these things and make them available not only on a website, but on one that was very user-friendly. And so we've created this website. If you put HTTPS with a couple of backslashes and olderadultnestegg.com, this is what will come up for you. Anybody can click this sign up button and it will create an account for you. And then you can get trained and certified on as many of the 3 instruments as you want. The 10-item financial decision tracker, the 34-item financial vulnerability assessment, and the 15-item friends and family interview. You can see that this is slightly outdated page because we do have the family and friends interview up there now. But the sign up button is still in the same spot. But you can also, if you scroll down on this page, you can click on to our training. So we have narrated online training and certification so that we know that people at least understand the basics about the scale. Then they can either administer the scale online or print out a PDF. And even if you print out a PDF, you can come back and enter your scores, and you will get a risk score, a recommendation, next steps, and other resources to consider. So we've been partnering with Adult Protective Services for several years, but especially this year, to implement this. And we've done nationwide, we've done about 2,000 training and certifications online. We've had over 360 adult protective service workers get trained, and over 150 have already administered scales. So we're very excited about that, and we're continuing to work on that. Here's some of the takeaway messages. I wanted to make sure also I leave some time for questions. The strength of an older adult's informed decision-making abilities does clearly intersect with his or her vulnerability to exploitation. These 3 new empirically supported financial decision-making scales have now become available, and online and narrated training certification scales are available for no charge to the users at this website. I want to recognize all my colleagues. My greatest acknowledgement is to my late wife, colleague Susan McNeil. And but I should point out how many colleagues here in Michigan it's taken to really move this ahead, including all of our funders. There's my contact information. I'll be sending you these slides later, and here's some resources. But here is what we want to make sure you will cut and paste into your browser and after this, and take some time to fill out the questionnaire. If you haven't given us your email yet, please put it in the chat box, because we will send you an email with a live link as well. But it's very important that we get feedback on this presentation. So we have a few minutes for questions and so forth. People can either say them verbally or write them in the chat box. Either way is fine with me. So let's see if there are any questions or comments. Give people a moment to write, or else I guess it was so clear that it answered everybody's questions, or people walked off in the middle. I don't know. You have to tell me. No questions.
Peter, I have a question for you.
Please.
So you gave us some really great data about how seniors form their thoughts and their perceptions and how cognition can impact. Have you got any words of wisdom for people that actually are the boots on the ground that interact with seniors? So my specific question is, um, what do you do when you're visiting with a senior who does not admit that there are some issues or some challenges? Do you have any strategies for working with them or around them?
Yes, actually, we do, and we're actually trying to. We've just written a couple grants to try to get some opportunity to validate these strategies, and we're borrowing heavily from a technique known as motivational interviewing that's been used in healthcare. Basically, the biggest thing is just like in dementia care, do not have a confrontation and don't clash, because that person is simply going to dig in their heels more and become distrustful. So you want to partner with them, and that sounds really hard. How are you going to do that? But one way is to start with the general and then work towards the specific, and the topic being financial exploitation in older adults. And one thing to do is to say, boy, I ask all the people I have a chance to sit down and talk with, how much do they know about what's going on with financial exploitation in older adults? And you can quote some of the statistics about older adults being the most targeted group, and the quadrupling of suspicious activity reports in the banks and so forth over the last few years, and the spike in the number of cases nationally. And you can ask people, hey, do you know anybody that's ever been exploited? And then say, it's something that we've been thinking about is, how do people, what's the best way to protect yourself and protect your financial health? And like, what would you want to have happen if if you use an accountant, or if you go and talk to the teller and they see that you're not yourself, that maybe you're confused about something? Have you have you made any plans about who are some of your trusted others that you really can count on to protect what you have? And see if they won't try to commit to some kind of basic protecting of their financial health. And then you can sort of try to work from there. So that's my recommendation, Ron, in terms of a general approach. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Well, we'll find out from from the evaluation whether this was something that gave people information they wanted or not. But thank you all, and we'll go ahead and sign off then.
Thank you, Peter.